Assalamu alaikum. Good evening and greetings of peace. My name is Yusuf Ismail. I'm an attorney, a public speaker, and a debater on contemporary issues and indeed comparative religion. And today we have a special edition for you this evening. Tonight, it is my privilege to have a special guest that I've been following for the past 20 years. Ziauddin Sardar, he's a British Pakistani scholar, an award-winning writer, a cultural critic, a public intellectual who specializes in Muslim intellectual thought, the future of Islam, futurology, science, cultural relations. He's the author of more than 50 books. I've been following his writing since 1998. Prospect magazine has named him as one of Britain's 100 public intellectuals. The Independent newspaper in the United Kingdom has called him Britain's own Muslim polymath. He's got a phenomenal history. He's had a 5-year stint at the King Abdulaziz University in the 1970s. In 1982, he joined London Weekend Television as a reporter and helped launch the program Eastern Eye. He's been described as an individual who has shaped the renaissance in intellectual thought within the worldview of Islam, the project of rescuing Islamic epistemology, as one of the writers to the preface of his books calls it, from tyrants and traditionalists, modernists and secularists, postmodernists and political opportunists. And of course, the urgency of that rescue is especially felt both in the West today and the Islamic world. Assalamu alaikum, Professor Sardar. It's a privilege to have you and welcome to the airwaves and of course the television stations of South Africa.
Wa alaikum salam. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. I want to start off with something because, I've been an avid reader. I would say kind of more like a fan of your writings from the 90s. In fact, the first book that I read of yours was a book called Distorted Imagination, Postmodern Lessons from the Rushdie Affair, which we'll delve into. But I want your thoughts. I need your thoughts. I believe you're no longer involved in contributions to journalism or the New Statesman. But, the past 2 years, and particularly tying it up with your theory of post-normal times, we're living today in a world that's not of our making. I just want to know your thoughts on the COVID pandemic and particularly what we've seen specifically in light of the global lockdown, in light of the pandemic that we've seen. Do you see this, as many have predicted in the 90s and certainly the early 2000s, as this kind of totalitarian step towards this kind of Orwellian fascism that you've seen, in the books like 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World? Or is that perhaps a bit of an exaggeration?
I would say that's a bit of an exaggeration. The pandemic was not a big surprise. I mean, I remember writing a paper in 2011 saying a big pandemic is on its way, right? So, and a lot of epidemiologists, scientists have predicted that. So it is not unusual. Now, what is unusual is this is the first pandemic that was totally global and that had impact on almost every aspect of our life. I mean, it basically stopped the world from ticking, even though the clock carried on, right? And almost everything stopped. We stopped traveling. We stopped even going out of the house, right? We stopped shopping. Nobody went to Hajj. It was, the haram was empty during the pandemic. And basically, it has been a very profound experience. It is the kind of pandemic that we have never experienced before. And that has got to do with the fact that the world has become very complex and very interconnected. Almost everything that we face now, all the problems we face are complex problems. And the pandemic has illustrated that very, very well, how interconnected we are and how every problem we face is connected to every other problem. So the pandemic was not just a health problem, it was also an economic problem. It was also a religious problem. It was also a mental problem because of the psychological impact. It was also an employment problem because many businesses shut down, many people became unemployment. It was a travel problem. Nobody actually travel, as I said, anywhere. You couldn't actually go out. So it was connected to so many different problems. So that's one of the kind of new things that we are facing today. that in an interconnected world where communication is instant, right? Impact is globalized. Things move very, very fast. Problems are complex, and therefore they're not normal. So the pandemic was not a normal pandemic. It was a kind of post-normal pandemic in the sense it is the first big post-normal pandemic we've had.
I just want your thoughts on one aspect, which I mean, and you know, there's been so much of debate on the issue of the pandemic, but the one thing which clearly comes out and which people point out, particularly, I mean, in your country, one of the issues that has been raised is the fact that with the onset of the pandemic, and you're going back to March 2020, there's been an increase in censorship. I'll give you a classic example. I mean, many analysts, and some of them, you can call them conspiracy theorists, they point out to, for example, in October or 2019, somewhere around that time, about the idea or the existence of simulated exercise. Now, this simulation was held by Johns Hopkins University, I believe the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, called Event 201, which was in fact a simulation on a coronavirus pandemic. About 2 or 3 months prior to the actual outbreak of a pandemic in China. And what people are saying is that the cynicism of the entire thing, that, you know, you've got these simulated exercises of, for example, coronavirus pandemic. You've got, for example, now questions being asked by government about, for example, you know, the lockdowns that were imposed and the idea and the models created by Neil Ferguson in your country, the idea that people are shut down in doorways and so on, and people now questioning, for example, the level of fatality and mortality of the pandemic. And you've got this kind of censorship that has been introduced on YouTube, on social media, shutting down alternative information and alternative opinion on what is happening around the world. I mean, have you not seen that as problematic?
Partly yes and partly no. Because a pandemic does require you to quarantine. I mean, this is a universal thing. We did that in Muslim civilization, right? So the vaccines are nothing new. Where do vaccines come from? One of the first vaccines was developed by Al-Razi in the 12th century against smallpox, right? And in fact, even to this day, some vaccines are made in the same way, in a similar way. Some, of course, are recombinant DNA. They are kind of new variety of vaccine, but most vaccines are made have been made. They actually contain the virus in a dead form that you kind of inject and so on and so forth. And the famous hadith, flee the leper. In other words, you have to quarantine the leper in a sense, because leprosy spreads and you have to treat them when they are in quarantine. So a pandemic like that does require quarantine. There's nothing wrong with alternative opinion and differences of opinion, but what is something wrong is with alternative facts in a sense. Right.
But I mean, the doctors from the
vaccines are a very effective treatment. Vaccines are a very effective treatment for a virus like the one we encountered. Right. In a sense, in fact, it's pretty evident that if we did not have the vaccines, that the virus would have carried on, devastating societies. Now, it is true that some people have then used that to suppress opinion, right, or to impose certain laws. Right? I think we need to differentiate between the two. What is good and necessary, and what has been used. What uses this as an excuse to impose certain other things. And of course, the biggest winners are the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
In that sense. So the global structure of medicine and how medicine is produced, that should be questioned, but not the vaccines themselves. They work. I mean, not the scientific evidence, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. So then, as a cultural critic, what do you make then of the fact that in the super information highway, We've got so many. I mean, I've seen it now. I don't know if you've seen it. You spoke about. I think you've written about medicine in some of your books. One of the articles you written years back was medicine in a multicultural society. But I mean, it seems to me that the medical fraternity has been more divided over the past 2 years than has ever been before. I mean, there's been a kind of an explosion of alternative information, suppression of one side, and then the pharmaceutical narrative has been kind of injected into our faces all the time.
That's partly true. I would agree with that. But I think the problem is with the global system as a whole, and also the nature of science and medicine. The science and medicine themselves are becoming very, very complex. I mean, for example, it is not unusual in a scientific enterprise for 3 or 4 different scientists to have 3 or 4 different opinions, right? And also, when you have a pandemic like the one we faced, we knew nothing about it to begin with. Right? There was complete and utter ignorance about it. So there was a built-in ignorance. And unless you could overcome that ignorance through research, you could not say anything concrete or anything objective. So a lot of different opinions came out during that period. It's only when we kept on doing research, more and more research, then the things began to become more systematic and became more objective in that sense. But science progresses by trial and error.
But do you not feel vindicated, Professor?
You have to allow for that.
Yes, I'm just questioning, do you not feel vindicated? I recall you mentioning in your books many years, I can't recall which one, where you made the argument that science in itself is very, at least conventional science, is value-based. It's values-based. And it channels, one particular imperial structural worldview. And I mean, I've seen that in the past 2 years more than at any time in history, whereby you see the kind of imperialist agenda that is manifest large, not only insofar as the type of remedies or medication that's being recommended, but even insofar as information out there is concerned. And I mean, this is evident on YouTube. We on YouTube, social media, you've got fact checks, you've got individuals that are just simply shutting out alternative ideas, alternative theories, people questioning germ theory. I mean, that was never the case before. Now it's been questioned en masse. I mean, there seems to be something that has happened.
What has happened is that social media has allowed all kinds of opinions to come to the fore. Right. And and there are lots of people who are almost deliberately, so in some cases, professionally spreading disinformation. So the question now arises: how do you separate, the wheat from the chaff? How do you get the truth, real facts out of all that kind of cloud? I call it smog of ignorance. How do you get out of that smog of ignorance that that is out there? So it's become very, 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 very challenging. And it's become, in that case, it's even more important that we really fact checks, and we don't accept everything that comes out on social media or everything that comes out that you can find on the internet.
So I think it's good. I want to move on. I just wanted your thoughts, because I was fascinated. I used to follow your articles in the New Statesman. I believe you no longer write for the New Statesman. So I haven't seen any of your. I tried to search online for anything you may have said on the lockdown, and I was interested in some of your ideas. I think you, in one of your probably podcasts, you link it to the idea of the post-normal times that we live in. And this is a kind of a manifestation of that at some level. I just want to move on. You are, more than anyone else, in my opinion, viewed as a kind of a pioneering writer on contemporary cultural issues within the world of Islam on future studies. And certainly two of your classic works, what I would say your magnum opus, The Future of Muslim Civilization. And in fact, I would say, I don't know if it is indeed a sequel, but I've always seen it as a sequel, and a far more superior book that you wrote in the 80s, Islamic Futures, the Shape of Ideas to Come. those have been the kind of books in terms of laying down, if I could put it in one way, the basis of your intellectual thought. Starting off with these books, what was your aim when you started off with these writings, and particularly in light of the fact that you constantly mention Islamic futures? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I think a little bit of background may be necessary. So
yeah, sure, go ahead.
So I as a young man, I was a very idealist about Islam. I thought that Islam was the perfect system, right? And the way to find that, the way to live that perfect system was to go to the place which was the birth of Islam. So fortunately, I found myself in Saudi Arabia during my mid-20s, and I spent 5 years there. And to be quite honest, the kind of Islam I found there disturbed me a great deal. It was always looking back. And also as a student activist, as a Muslim student activist, growing up on kind of the standard literature of Jamaat Islami, Muslim Brotherhood and all that, which shaped my initial ideas. It was always looking back in history. So I wanted to ask the question, well, what is in the front? What about the future? And in fact, before I wrote down The Future of Muslim Civilization, I did a great deal of search to find out if anybody had written anything about the future of Islam, and I couldn't find anything. The only thing I found was a book by W.S. Blunt called The Future of Islam, which was published around 1880, 1881, 82, something like that, towards the end of the 19th century. And Blunt was an administrator, colonial administrator in Cairo, and he wanted to reform Islam. But of course, he also wanted the British colonial enterprise to continue. Right? So he studied the Muslim society, and he studied population growth, educational situation, poverty, and all that, and developed certain kind of plans, which he then forwarded to the Foreign Office here. And the Foreign Office accepted more or less his recommendation. And then eventually he published those as an article in the London magazine, and then turned it into a book. That was the only book that I could find. But I could also see that Blunt's work was pretty good, because a great deal of what followed was based on his recommendations about how to control population, what kind of education to introduce in Egypt and other places. So, and the vision the society that I lived in Saudi Arabia in the 70s, as I said, disturbed me, and I wanted a totally alternative vision. How could I be a different kind of Muslim? So the Future of Muslim Civilization presents an alternative vision of what Islam can be. It asks some fundamental questions about Islam, and it presents totally kind of, here is my vision of Islam. So it's in some ways quite a subjective book, right? Yeah. It analyzes things, but it says, here is my particular vision of Islam. That's the kind of Islam I would like. And by Islamic futures, I simply mean a future that is shaped by the ethics of Islam, by the worldview of Islam. Right. Now, having done that, then looking around the Muslim world, there were lots of different ideas that existed in reality. The idea of Islamization, the idea of Islamic State, right? All of these idea of Islamic economics, all of these were emerging. So I wanted to look at them as well and see what kind of future they will lead into. And some of the kind of forecasts I made in Islamic futures, the shape of ideas to come, have turned out right. One of the most blatant obvious examples is my scenarios on Makkah, how Makkah will be shaped and turned into a shopping mall. And it's described there, and it has turned out to be exactly
shockingly accurate all these years.
Written in what,
1985. It was 85, and then
written in 85.
Was 79.
And what I thought the Islamic states will be a disaster, right? And which all Islamic states have turned out, because I basically argued that the way the Islamic states are structured, where religion and politics are one and the same, you're going to get, kind of authoritarianism of one kind or another, and which is in fact, to very large extent what has happened. And my criticism of Islamization, for example, or specifically Islamization of knowledge, was that the conventional structure of knowledge is such that it cannot be Islamized. You cannot breathe ilahiyat in a discipline, for example, the discipline of anthropology, which was developed essentially to manage and control non-Western cultures. How do you make it how do you make it Islamic, as it were? And my basic argument was that disciplines do not come out of the air. God has not structured the world. This is sociology, this is anthropology, this is physics, this is chemistry. It is we who have structured. Disciplines come out of a particular need of a society, and we need disciplines that fulfill over need and requirement. Right. So that was the kind of basic. So the future Muslim civilization presents a purely kind of visionary vision, a subjective, personal vision of a future civilization. And Islamic future, the shape of ideas to come, looks at what ideas were there during the 80s and 70s and 80s, and how they will transform the world, or what impact they will have, and where will they go.
It appears to me that, and as I think you hinted it, that the future of Muslim civilization, in fact, also grew. One of the contributing factors was the sense of disenfranchisement that you yourself as an individual felt within Saudi society. Yeah. I mean, you were there for a period of about 5 years. And I think you make the point that, or at least we can see today, that back then in the 70s, certainly, and more so today, it was a very dislocated society. But what specifically disturbed you back in the 70s? I mean, the kind of authoritarianism,
the kind of a one-dimensional notion of the Sharia based on just crime and punishment, racism, basically. I mean, there's a clear kind of I described it as a Saudi sandwich, where you had the very rich Saudis on top and the Bedouin poor at the bottom, and then various varieties of people, starting with different colors, Yemenis at the bottom, then Pakistani, Bangladeshis, and Filipinos, right? And then you had the Europeans, then you had the Americans, then you had the Americans.
But what has changed? I mean, if you look, for example, today, and I don't want to detract from the trajectory of our discussion, but I have to ask you this, that Saudi society today has evolved to the extent that there seems to be this kind of schizophrenic relationship with the world. And I'll give you one classic example, that MBS. I mean, I don't think MBS has a bin Salman, who's de facto the king, the monarch in the country. His father's senile. I don't think he's got a kind of a precedent in terms of on the one hand, there seems to be the sense of false sense of liberalization, which obviously includes the embracement of the licentiousness of Western culture. And I mean, you see this in the sense where there are reports about him having involved in sex orgies and inviting prostitutes, whereas on the other hand, there's this element of religious conservatism, which is misapplied to the population, to the extent that it keeps them in a sense of perpetual subjugation. And of course, this can obviously manifest on political dissidents. We have the Khashoggi case, and religious leaders, religious scholars, and political dissidents in general. What has changed? I mean, what do you see? Because on the one hand, I see, and I'm surprised, people like Robert Spencer, the well-known Islamophobe, was praising bin Salman on the fact that he has a so-called NEOM project, the future for 2030, Saudi Arabia. And at the same time, praising him for example, purportedly speaking about introducing some degree of self-reform, reforming Islam, doing away with the hadith. But I see a kind of a schizophrenic approach in terms of the relationship with the Islamic faith, and indeed what is really happening in Saudi society. Well, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think let's just step back a little bit. Saudi Arabia is actually trapped. It's trapped in an extreme religious conservatism, which has deep roots and from which it needs to move out. And most young Saudis realize that this has to be done. And it is trapped in ultra-modernity, which it doesn't really understand, but it likes the glitz of it, right? And the two are not gelling in ways. That's what you get something like.
But they seem to be immersed. They seem to be, I mean, somehow or the other immersed together.
Yeah. they emerge together, and neither actually makes sense, right? And so there is no viable position that Saudi Arabia can actually move into. That's the, and I think it's a problem. It's a very profound problem, and it requires very serious thinking. And no king or monarch or anybody individually can actually solve the problem, in a sense. And it's a problem that has to be kind of tackled in a very systematic way, and it has to take the Saudi population with it, right? So you can't ditch all those conservative scholars, for example. They are very conservative and they are very narrow-minded, but you cannot lock them all up and say that they don't exist. Neither can you kind of dispense with the modernists and the secularists, right, who are just as deeply entrenched and just as intoxicated by the West, right, and cannot take a critical approach to the West, just as the conservatives cannot take a critical approach to Islam, right? You have to kind of square the circle in a sense. So you need lots of dialogue. The society has to open and really have some dialogue so that the contradictions can be resolved. Now, this is also a very post-normal phenomenon. In a complex situation, in a complex world, right, difference of opinions emerge much more quickly and more rapidly than they do in a simple system. So contradictions arise, and some of the contradictions, but basically contradictions are logical inconsistencies that cannot be reconciled. They have to be transcended, right? You have to develop some sort of system where you can negotiate bits and pieces of various segments of the system, and then transcend and create something new synthesis. So I believe that if the Saudis could actually transcend their divisions between extreme conservatism and ultra-modernity and transcend them, they would create a new synthesis which will be truly profound and transformative. But how do they do that? Well, that's the $64 million question. And you can't do that from the top, or you can't just do that from the bottom. It has to be a combination of both, and the voices of the citizens have to be heard. They have to be brought in. See, if you bring in somebody who has extremist view and start talking to them, and a lot of moderate views come in, the extremist view adjusts itself and incorporates some of the moderate positions, and then you can move forward. But if you just have two extremists shouting at each other, right, then you're going to get the kind of thing that we are getting in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're going from ultra-conservatism to ultra-modernity without a in-between period, as it were, right? And therefore, they will be they will face insecurity, uncertainty because of that.
If it's immersed with ultra-religious conservatism, and I believe it is, but why then are the religious conservatives also being severely targeted?
Yeah,
I mean, you see clearly cases.
I mean, because
they're being imprisoned by MBS.
That's right. Because he wants an ultra-modern Saudi Arabia, but by suppressing the ultra-conservatives, he actually makes them stronger.
Yeah,
because they will get much more support, and there will be lots of pent-up resentment against him, lots of strife, and so on and so forth. You can't just bottle them up and lock them up and think that that's all right. They will, like, one of these days, explode. And this is exactly what happened with for example, with the Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Taliban essentially are a reaction against modernity. Islamic revolution in Iran was a reaction against ultra-modernity of the Shah. The Shah was doing something very similar to what MBS is doing in Iran in the 70s and the 80s. And the revolution was against that kind of ultra modernity that Shah was trying to impose. So what you have, if you have one extreme, the pendulum doesn't come in the middle. The pendulum always swings from one extreme to another extreme. So if you have ultra modernity, you are going to end up with ultra conservatism or radicalism, fanaticism, and the kind of things we have seen, for example, in the case of ISIS, or before that, Al Qaeda.
Would I not be then correct that movements like the Taliban are more specifically not a reaction, but more a product of ultra modernity? Because
that's the irony, isn't it? That they're both a reaction against modernity,
and
but
a product.
But of course, they are at the end of the day also a product of modernity. So I mean, this is not just limited to Muslim societies. This has also happened in the West. So now let's just move on to talk about postmodernism very briefly.
Yeah.
Postmodernism emerged as a reaction against modernity. So philosophers and thinkers and people with well-meaning people, well-meaning thinkers said, there is a problem here with modernity. The consequences of modernity are too there. Development destroys society. Modernity does not allow non-Western voices to come up. It doesn't allow women to speak, right? So we need to do. So postmodernism actually was developed as a reaction to modernity. So what did postmodernism say? It observed certain things, and it basically began as an epistemology, because the first book that was ever written was called, Postmodernism, a report on knowledge. It was an epistemological exercise, right? It began as a theory of knowledge, and one of his basic assumption was that the grand narratives have collapsed. That is, modernity itself is a grand narrative, but anything that gives you meaning and sense of direction has no meaning, right? So it's not just that modernity has no meaning, but religion has no meaning, history has no meaning, tradition has no meaning. Anything that what is termed as grand narrative shapes the overall pictures of a society, has its values and tradition in it, has no meaning. So that was the first. And then second consequences of that is that truth is relative.
Yeah.
Right. And third, of course, they wanted to give voice to the voiceless. But how to give the voice to the voiceless? Because postmodernism itself was a Western liberal philosophical construction. So the voiceless can speak, but why did they spoke with the voice of postmodernism, which was liberal secularism? So as long as you were liberal secularists, as long as you were liberal secularists, your voice was part of postmodernism. But then what did postmodernism end up with? That's the point I'm making. Ironically, postmodernism, which started as a reaction against modernity, ended up enhancing modernity. It became a product of modernity, and one of my books is titled, Postmodernism and the new imperialism of Western culture. It became a new kind of arch narrative. Even though it is said there are no grand narratives, it itself became a grand narrative.
Right. So as I understand the definition, because I just want for those out there who are not familiar with the idea, because this kind of goes into the realms of philosophy. Postmodernism, as I understand, is a philosophy, promoting a kind of a theory of liberation that promotes pluralism.
Yes.
Apparently, would I be correct that this is now saying that people from other non-Western cultures are now given representation, and the marginalized people of the West? Is that the understanding?
That was exactly the idea. That was exactly the idea of postmodernism. But it gives you representation, provided you speak the language of liberal secularism. It doesn't give you representation if you speak the language of, say, the Taliban.
I see. So or
you speak the language of conservative Islam.
So essentially, then the understanding is that provided the other mirrors the dominant Western contemporary intellectual ideas, then they would be kind of accepted. Would that be my correct understanding?
Yes. So they will be part. They become part of the system. So the kind of world we find ourselves in is a partly product of postmodernism. I mean, this idea of post-truth, for example. If you say all truth is relative, you end up with no truth at all, and you end up with post-truth. And if everything is subjective, then you end up with alternative facts, right? And of course, social media and internet, we were talking about it earlier on, is full of so-called alternative facts, right? The spokesperson of Trump articulated that. She said in one of her press conferences, there are alternative facts, right? And people say, well, facts are facts, but so we are in a sense, and of course, postmodernism enhanced consumerism. At the end of the day, the only thing that gave meaning was consumption, right?
You gave the example of
about architecture, it was about art, but it was also about shopping. It was also about shopping malls, right? In a sense, that's how it ended up enhancing modernity. So
I recall you gave the example, Professor, of Anita Roddick from The Body Shop, whereby she would go to Latin America and take these products from Latin America, and of course they'd repackage them, and the same thing would do with religion. They take aspects of, for example, of within Zen Buddhism, Sufism, studies of the yoga, and then they create this kind of potpourri kind of religious worldview that is then, kind of sold in a consumerist fashion. But what I want to know, Professor, is that are these so-called Eastern spiritual, what I would call them, professional fraudsters, not also perpetuating that idea? I mean, I'll give you a classic example. You had, in the 60s, you had the Maharishi. Now today, the individual that's becoming very popular, there's the Sadhu Guru, who, in my opinion, very insidiously and incisively, but more sophisticatedly, channels Hindutva culture and the Hindu supremacism in India, but at the same time is now presented on Western televisions as a kind of spiritual leader that is sharing spiritual truths of us. Is this not a product of postmodernism as well?
To some extent, yes. We can't blame everything on postmodernism. I mean, this sort of thing has existed in the past, but what has happened is that he has been globalized. So you'll have a guru. He will have a guru like that who will be fooling people in India, in a particular region, and will remain regional. And maybe if he's fortunate, he'll become a national kind of guru. But because of globalization and how the West is kind of hungry for kind of spirituality, and wants to grab spirituality from wherever it can, and how it kind of exoticizes Eastern thought and Eastern philosophies and Eastern mysticism, provides him with an opportunity to go global and sell his product. I mean, he's basically selling a product.
Yeah, and the product is spirituality. He's fangled
spirituality. And just as some
Deepak Chopra, Deepak Chopra would be doing the same.
Is a good example. Deepak Chopra is a good example. But also there are a lot of Muslim preachers who are also selling, Islam as a brand of soap. It washes whiter than white, right? So they are also, doing exactly the same thing.
Well, would someone like Zakir Naik, for example, come to mind?
Zakir Naik is a good example. Zakir Naik, I think, is a very, very good example of, and he has vast following. Essentially, basically, disparaging all of the religions, right, and presenting Islam as a supremacist worldview.
Although he doesn't make the claim, as I understand, his work focuses more on apologetics. There's a background and a context behind it, but I get the sense in terms of what you're trying to convey. I want to come back to our initial discussion. Before I go there, since we've discussed modernity and postmodernism, and you alluded to initially your influences as a student by the works of Jamaat-e-Islami and Ikhwan and so on. What has always fascinated me is that when you look at Islamic, what I would call in inverted commas, Islamic modernism, or the so-called Islamic modernists, the figures that come to mind are people like Jamaluddin Afghani, Mufti Muhammad Abdu in Egypt, Rashid Rida, and so on. And what always fascinates me is that these were viewed as Muslim modernists. These were individuals that the traditionalists would reject. And yet the influence, Mufti Muhammad Abdu Afghani, for example, they were the kind of primary influences to the formation and establishment of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. And then the Ikhwan, of course, led to, influences, cross-pollination with Jamaat-e-Islami.
Yeah.
And now, in today's 21st century, right-wing pundits and Islamophobes cite the works of Maududi and Sayyid Qutb as being the kind of spiritual godfathers of Islamic radicalism. I mean, you couldn't make it up more. I mean, how do you explain that? I mean, from modernity.
I think you again we need to look at it in the context. You see, Jamaluddin Afghani and Muhammad Abdul Rashid Rida, they were struggling with how to understand and adjust to modernity, right? And they faced colossal challenges, right? And they did the best they could under the circumstances. They argued that Islam needed reform, as did Muhammad Iqbal 20, 30 years after them. The reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, the famous book of Iqbal. They all thought that we need to rethink what Islam is, right, and adjust to modernity. The generation that followed, Sayyid Qutb and Maulana Maududi, were trying to do the same in their own way, but the world has changed. Nation states had emerged, and therefore they kind of, if you like, latched onto that idea of having Islamic State and all that. But now we need to move on from there. Instead of disparaging them, we must critique them. It is very, very important to engage with them critically, but then we need to move on because the world has changed drastically.
Well, what is the problem?
Let me put it in a very simple way. See, both Maududi and Qutb, and to some extent the earlier thinkers, they thought this is Islam and that is not Islam. This is us and this is the other. In this case, the other is the West. But in the 21st century, there is no other in that sense. First of all, there is no Islam in the West. There is more West in Muslim countries than sometimes in the West. And there is more kind of Islam in the West than it is sometimes in Islamic countries, right? I'm not just talking about the population, I'm also talking about the ideas and the concept and so on and so forth. But more than that, you see, we now find ourselves in a situation where things go planetary very quickly. So if climate change is coming, well, not coming, we are experiencing climate change in real time. It would not differentiate between Muslim people and non-Muslim people. It will affect everybody, right? We are in a very interdependent world, right? So we cannot think of ourselves as though we live in a ghetto anymore. Yes. We need to have a much more universal view of ourselves and of our worldview. And it's not just climate change. Virtually almost anything that happens has impact globally. Right? You look at what is happening in Ukraine, right? It's not just that Ukraine is being invaded by Russia, but the impact is on throughout the world, and every individual will feel the impact in the cost of living, or if they're a European country with more migrants coming in, looking after Ukrainian migrants, sanctions that have been imposed on Russia will have effect on other countries as well, and so on and so forth. Right. So we cannot think that we exist in isolation anymore. Right. So we have to think in big, and we have to think universal, in a sense. Right. And if you're thinking in a universal way, then there is no other. There's all us. There are different kinds of us, but they are all us in that sense, right? And that's the transformation that we need. Yes, Maududi and Qutb, they were working in history. They had a particular context. We need to appreciate them in that context. I mean, both of them had genuine concerns about Islam and Muslims.
Mm.
Right? I'm very critical of Maudud's thought, and I'm quite critical of certain, Sayyid Qutb's thought. But say my notion of justice comes from Sayyid Qutb's book, Social Justice in Islam, which was written like 20, 30 years before he wrote Milestone, which itself is a product of what he was going through. So it has to be seen within his own context. Here is a man who's been tortured, right? Who suffered phenomenally in that sense. And Sayyid Qutb of Milestone is not the same as, in the shade of the Quran, right? Which also kind of I read a lot during my student days, right? So we need to see these people in their context, right? And learn as much as we can from their mistakes as well as their successes, and then move on, right? And we need to kind of start thinking.
But I want you to clear this up for us, because and I understand and I appreciate your position, but the far right today, even now, and I'm talking about, you open a journal, the idea that is being presented, and I would say wrongly so, is that cults like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, radicalization in the Muslim world, these are products of the works of Qutb, for example, and Maududi.
You see, that may be true.
That has always been presented, and that is wrong in my opinion. Would I be correct?
You see the impact of certain authors on others cannot be, you cannot really judge them, or you cannot really trace as a straight line that, this is ISIS, this is Qutb, and that's how it came in one straight line. One of the things that postmodernism, by the way, did argue is that once an author writes a book, then book has an independent entity. How it is interpreted by others may bear no relationship to the author. Some of the books that I've written have been totally interpreted in a way that I never conceived of when I was writing. So let us kind of move on from that, because one of the kind of, if you like, Western tactic is to get us involved in these absurd debates and discussions and seep of energy that do not take us anywhere. Let us look forward and think in terms of the kind of future that we want, and what do we have to do now to shape the future that we want, in a sense, right? It's the kind of the message that I was trying to give 50 years ago with the future of Muslim civilization, right? Let us really think where we are now, the kind of world that we live in, and how do we shape a future which is based on certain notions that we cherish, some, unity or trusteeship.
Yes, sure. What is quite clear in your works as well is that there was an ebb, there was a crescendo, and there was a decline. You point this out clearly, that a certain period in the history of civilization, because of its achievements, failures, or combination of both, can in fact be made a standard or criterion for judging and evaluating other periods. Now, the question is, and the question which you have also raised as well many times, is that, what are the standards or the criteria can we evaluate the decline of Muslims? Certainly there was a decline in history. And at this juncture, do we see a continuation of that decline, or just simply do you sense, for example, this kind of light, this revitalization, the fact that somehow or the other there is this renewed energy that is slowly emerging, or do you just simply see a stagnant continuation of that decline, or just simply a period of limbo at this juncture?
At this juncture, I see a great deal of hope from young people, from young scholars. A whole generation of young Muslim scholars and thinkers and journalists have emerged who have done some phenomenal work, for example, in Britain itself, but I've seen that throughout the world. But we are also at the same time, sometimes things, as I said, tend to be contradictory, especially in these times. There are lots of contradictions. Yes, I see a great deal of emerging hope from young thinkers, scholars, but at the same time, there's also a perpetual kind of decline as well. in the, we seem to be on a declining slope. And that is because we are still trapped in history. By that I mean we are trapped in an imagined history of some purity in the past that we want to recapture,
which we will not be able to.
Which will not be able to do, and this is even you find that even in excuse me. You find that even in very learned people, they still hark back, right? This hadith says so and so, therefore I must do so and so because I cherish hadith. They've forgotten that the context of the world has changed, right? And here I think I do want to point out certain very profound things that have happened over the last 10, 15, 20 years. One of them is climate change, which is going to have a major impact throughout the world. In fact, the fact that we live in a kind of a world of limited resources was brought out in 1972 with the famous book, The Limits to Growth, How Far Can We Grow, right? And our economic system is based on growth, right? And we cannot continue perpetually to grow, right? So we need a totally different philosophy in that sense, and that's become, quite evident that we are not sustainable. That something has to be done about sustainability. And when I was growing up, we were taking it for granted that the West is the supreme power. That is no longer true. The West is definitely declining in more ways than one, right? Political and economic power shifting to the East, to China, to Russia, to India, even to places like Turkey, Indonesia, right? So the power shift is, the geopolitical realignment is a major realignment, which is happening after almost 200 years of European Western colonial imperialism, right? So that's a very, very profound shift. But something even more profound is happening in Europe and the West itself. And that is the re-emergence of the far right. The post-Second World War.
Well, why is that? Why is that, Professor?
The post-Second World War West was based on a very simple idea: never again, never fascism again, right? But now one in three French people vote for a fascist party. In Hungary and Poland, fascist parties far-right parties are in power. In America, we have almost half the society, kind of supports a fantasy world, of Trump that we cannot even reconcile in any sensible way, right? Right. So something very profound is happening within Western societies as well, right? The emergence of far right is a pretty frightening phenomena that we can. And then, of course, there have been technological revolutions over the last 20, 30 years that have transformed the world. Internet, artificial intelligence, social media. So never in the history of humanity could we actually communicate with millions of people instantly, which is what a tweet does. If you have millions of followers, you tweet, everybody gets it instantly in a sense. That level of communication has never existed, right? So very profound changes have going on. And the geologists now tell us that we have entered a new geological age, the Anthropocene, where the overactivities, the activities of human being can transform the geology and ecology of the planet as a whole. So we are in a very different era. This is not the era of Maududi and Jamaluddin Afghani, or let alone, Ibn Kathir and all the other, historical. We are in a totally different era. Right? I mean, here, the basic notion of Islamic law, chaos does not work. There are no analogies.
We don't have analogy.
There is no analogy for the Anthropocene. There's no analogy for the kind of social media and communication that we have. There's no analogy for climate change. right? There's no analogy for the fact that we can now see Earth from the heavens, as it were, right? And a small planet. So there are no analogies. We live in a totally different world in a sense. So we have to rethink how do we navigate our way out of this world. And the basic point that I've been making for the last 10 years, that the world has become very complex and very contradictory. And if you have a complex system, you have positive feedback, and contradictions multiply the positive feedback, and you have chaotic events. So again and again, we are seeing chaotic events, right? The pandemic was a chaotic event. The invasion of Ukraine is a chaotic event, right? And we will see more and more such chaotic events. So the post-normal times is a product, is kind of shaped by these three C's, chaos, complexity, contradictions, and chaos. And why are we seeing complexity, chaos, and contradictions? Because we are now hooked on speed. Everything moves faster and faster and faster. We want things faster. We want deliveries faster, faster internet, faster communication, fast this, fast, right? Speed has become the essence, and the world is changing very, very rapidly because of this speed, right? And not just speed, but things now happen fast, but they also go global very fast. I mean, there is a very famous example of the South African woman who was, what was it? I forgot her name, who was traveling from America to one of the South African cities, and she tweeted, "I'm going to South Africa. I hope I don't get AIDS. Haha, I'm only joking." Right? I don't know. You remember Jessica?
Yes, I recall. It became viral. The tweet
went viral, and in fact, by the time she arrived at the airport, millions of people were kind of criticizing her tweet, and within 24 hours, she more or less lost her job. Right. So things move fast, right? They they become global very quickly, and they have an impact on the individual. Right? It's not just a global. And there's one other thing, which is the speed, scope, and scale of how things are changing, but also simultaneously. Things tend to happen simultaneously. Right. Yes. It's not that we get hit with one crisis. We get hit of one crisis, second crisis, third crisis. Even if nowadays the hurricanes come simultaneously. They used to come, you get one hurricane, in 3-5 years, but now within 24-hour period, you will get 3 or 4 hurricanes. So things are happening simultaneously. So 3 C's and 4 S's. The 4 S's are driving us towards 3 C's. And so we now live in a totally different world where what we took for granted does not make sense anymore. And what we took for granted was modernity. What we took for granted was postmodernism. What we took for granted was the paradigms based on modernity, and the paradigm of that growth is essential. The paradigm that progress has to be linear. The paradigm that we must consume more and more. The paradigm on which contemporary economic capitalism is based. The paradigm about medicine, that human body you have to intervene with human body perpetually. And even the notion that death can be defeated.
Yes, people want things permanent.
All that. So these are essentially paradigms of the West. So the paradigms of the West are either collapsed or are collapsing, and they just do not work.
So this takes me then.
Here then we have an opportunity of creating paradigms that are based on our ethics and values, but also universal.
Yes.
New paradigms. And that requires us to think what kind of new sustainable economics system do we need? What kind of governance, we need that does not divide people but brings people together.
There's so much you've said there, Professor, and each aspect, each analysis can open up so many issues. But I want to ask this. You are the primary proponent, I think, of the idea of post-normal times in the world today. Is the idea of the post-normal, is it a byproduct of post-modernity? Do we not see post-modernity today, or is post-modernism a thing of the past? and no longer
okay. Yeah,
relevant?
that's a very good question. So when paradigms die, they don't die instantly. They linger on for a very long time. Yeah, and they overlap. So at the moment we are living in a world that is simultaneously modern and postmodern, right? But is also going post-normal, right? In other words, the normality that modernity and postmodernism brought is dissolving. Yeah, nothing makes sense. Nothing makes sense in that way. But both postmodernism and modernity as a concept, an ideal, are dead, in my opinion.
Mm.
Postmodernism as an ideal is totally dead. Not many academics are now left. Say in the 90s, we went to everywhere, every Muslim university I met, people were kind of proudly announcing themselves as postmodern. But I think that is not happening anymore. Postmodernism as a kind of ideal philosophy is dead. But postmodernism.
What about in popular culture? In popular culture, I mean, one of the prime postmodernist popular culture movies, if I understand, was The Matrix. The Matrix was cited as a postmodernist cultural phenomenon. And we see The Matrix now, The Matrix Resurrection.
Coming back, So as I said, the ideas linger on, the products linger on, even though. So the Matrix Resurrection, the new film, I haven't seen it, so I want to see it. Has not had the kind of impact that the original Matrix had, because that was the peak of postmodern times in that sense, which was basically arguing that there is no kind of difference between virtual.
There's no reality. I've always wanted to understand that
distinction between.
But Professor, if I don't want to interrupt you, but what was the philosophy? Because I was always confused that what the Matrix was saying, and you see this, for example, in the writings of the Turkish character that Looney, Harun Yahya, is that reality does not exist. The whole notion is that what we see around you is a product of the internalization of your senses, the sensory perception. The Matrix obviously took it to the level of artificial intelligence and the fact that we are all tied up to the whole notion of these computer wirings, and then what we see are fed in by the artificial intelligence. But I'm saying, is that the idea of the reality and the nature of reality within Islamic philosophy and philosophical thought? Do we not have that? Do we not have the idea that that what we see around us is not in fact real? And I mean, people like Adnan Oktar, I mean, although he's been, exposed in Turkey, but I mean, his books are very popular in the 90s, which threw out this idea, the nature of reality. And this was from an Islamic perspective.
Yeah, we get fashions for these sort of things. They tend to come in cycles in sense. Now, I think it has to be made. I just want to make one point clear. There's a very famous article, is it by Derrida? The Gulf War did not happen.
Yes.
Like that. Yeah. Now, there the argument is presented very, very clearly. What he's saying is that for many people, the Gulf War was like a video game.
Yeah.
They experienced it like a video game, right? But that doesn't mean that the people who were being bombed were not suffering, right? So you need to differentiate between that, right? So if you're arguing that there's no reality and if you cause me pain, I'm not going to feel pain, well, that's clearly an absurd idea. Yeah. But what is reality, of course, has been a long discussion in Islamic thought, and our mystics.
What was 9/11?
Our mystics are kind of. So there is, for example, the notion that this world is an illusion, right?
Yes.
This is very common in Sufi thought in that sense. And of course, we also believe, as a matter of kind of faith, that this world is a transitory place. Yeah, yes. For us as individuals, it is a transitory place. We have a very and there are various hadiths that think of the longer period that will come after that, which will be infinite in terms of that, in that sense.
Yeah.
So, but I'm a rationalist and a realist, right?
Yes.
This is very physical world. very physical problems that need to be solved in very physical way, right? And this is not a place for delusions or romanticizing or imagining something that you can capture from history.
Well, was 9/11 a postmodernist phenomenon? What happened on 9/11?
I think no.
I tell you why. In your book, Postmodernism and the Other, you critique an individual by the name of David Ray Griffin, who was a theologian, and he more than any other has written enormously on the issue of 9/11, but more from the perspective, not that it didn't happen, but the idea that it was indeed, elements within the military-industrial complex, the U.S. government, and of course, the so-called patsies that were involved in the collapse of the Twin Towers. And so what you saw and being told by the media about Muslim extremists coming and taking over, and of course, crashing planes into buildings, there were a number of factors, World Trade Center 7.
This is what happens when you cannot distinguish reality from illusion, you see, in a sense. You end up with conspiracy theories.
Like, so our conspiracy theories.
You see, it saying that is very similar to the Russians now telling their own people that the Ukrainians are bombing their own cities. Right? It's basically equivalent of that. Why would CIA or the Pentagon destroy their own towers? I mean, makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's a pretty absurd thing to say.
I mean, the new Pearl Harbor.
One of the big problems with contemporary Muslim societies is this immersion on conspiracy theories, and that's essentially an expression of powerlessness. Because you have no agency, or you think you have no agency, you have to rely on these conspiracy theories, these illusions, and the truth is often very simple. You have an enemy, and his enemy is targeting you. Full stop, right? And you need to do something about that. Every society, every community is diverse. Just like the Muslims have liberals and extremists and left wings and right wings, all of the societies have the same kind of diversity of views, in a sense. So you can't, demonize a single people, right? You need to appreciate the human societies, tend to be complex, diverse things, in a sense. And these basic things we still haven't learned, and every kind of lunatic who comes around with some conspiracy theory, it will spread like wildfire in Muslim societies. That's a major problem, because it kind of blocks critical thinking. What we really need in our society.
A lot of them emerged from your country, Professor. I mean, one individual that comes to mind. I've enjoyed some of his works. David Icke from the United Kingdom, I believe, from the Isle of Wight. That comes up with these ideas. I just want to move on and say, because we still got a bit of issues, and then we're going to obviously wrap up. You did mention your kind of your impressions on the idea that there are new young scholars coming up, and this basically takes us to the whole realm of the ulama, and certainly when you look at your book, which is a phenomenal book, I'd recommend, which I believe is a collection of your writings, Reading the Quran: The Contemporary Relevance of the Sacred Text of Islam. One of the key issues you make is that at some point in time, at some point within history, the kind of proliferation of written texts began to undermine the authority and control that the ulama enjoyed over the Muslim rulers and the masses. And the fact that the Quran was, getting open to a whole host of wild interpretations by unqualified individuals, there was then this kind of control that was imposed in terms of limiting the interpretative thought and relationship of the individual with the Quran, to the extent that the Quran became something which was, where the individual lacked the agency to, as you regularly state, develop this interpretative relationship with the text of the Quran, whereby it becomes very much contemporaneous to how he relates to the rest of society. What led to that? I mean, what do we see that happening up to this day, or do you see this change? That, I mean, the reality is the World Wide Web has exploded all of that. I mean, this control no longer exists.
But the ulama still have some power. I mean, that is not to say that they
is it wrong? Would you say this is wrong? Would this be of a concern to you?
If the alim is a learned individual, then it's not a concern of me. But many ulama are not learned in, I would argue. Some of them don't even know their own basic Islamic history. They have read certain texts. They went to the Nadwa where they had read their, half a dozen fixed texts. And that's all the knowledge they have, both of Islam and the world. I wouldn't regard that as very, 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 very learned in a sense. But classical alim, in the classical Muslim civilization, alim was anybody with knowledge. So scientists were alims, right? Philosophers were alims. Sufis were alims, right?
You gave Al-Biruni. You mentioned Al-Biruni.
I mentioned Al-Biruni, one of my favorite, my hero. The reason I like Al-Biruni is because he was such a pluralist. He believed in plural in terms of method. He was a pluralist. You need a method for a right, inquiry that you are engaging in. You need a appropriate method for that inquiry. Whether if you're measuring the specific gravity of metals, then you need another method. But if you're studying India, then you need another method. If you're measuring the coordinates of the city, then you needed another method, right? And then when he went to India and he came across yoga, what a contemporary scholar, Muslim alim, when it comes across yoga, will say, this is Hinduism, this is haram, this has no validity. But Al-Biruni in the 12th century didn't say that. He said this is a profound system, and the only way you can understand it is through his own concepts and metaphysics, right? Now that's a very profound thought, right? And it was so advanced, from that. I mean, that's genuine pluralism, to appreciate the culture of another society, and to argue that the best way to understand it is to understand it with its own terms and values.
Right. So your argument would then be, Professor, that, and I'm citing Al-Biruni as what you would call a multidisciplinary scholar, whereby knowledge, was kind of integrated as a whole. There were mathematicians and scientists, but at the same time, had this kind of fundamental, deep, intrinsic understanding of the Quran, of the prophetic traditions, and so on. But in the 21st century, I mean, the idea of an alim as a multidisciplinary scholar, I mean, is that pragmatic? Is that even practical?
Well,
is that even
it's
possible?
Even more necessary. It is even more necessary now.
But with knowledge so deep, I mean, with knowledge in so many disciplines.
Remember what I was saying there earlier on, that almost all our problems are complex problems.
Yes.
It doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or Hindu or wherever you live, whatever society you are living, your problems are complex problems. And the thing about complex problems is they need complex approaches. So you can't solve a complex problem with a single discipline. We have to move on to interdisciplinary inquiries, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary inquiries, right? Which means that at least the inquiry should be conducted in groups which involve various disciplines. And at least some of those people should be able to engage in, and appreciate, understand different disciplines, right? So, in my opinion, the classical kind of polymathy that existed provides us with a kind of a vision of the kind of interdisciplinary inquiries that we need to undertake today, in a sense. And we need people who are to some extent polymaths. Not everybody can be,
sure.
But we do need. I mean, for example, I think a contemporary alim must have a very good understanding of modernity, of post-normal times, right? As well as Islamic thought and Sharia and all that, to actually appreciate where we are and what kind of solutions from a perspective of Islam we can actually bring in.
Would you call for the overhaul of the present traditionalist Islamic educational system?
I would argue that it's become totally irrelevant. Has absolutely no relevance to the contemporary Muslim societies. It's like they are basically like psychotherapy. I know some of my very close friends, I will not mention, even South African ones, will be very upset by me saying that. They defend the madrasa system, despite the fact they criticize it, they still think the madrasa system is great. I don't.
What would replace it? What would replace it? And what would your vision be for that? What would you say?
Yeah, I think we need to rethink what education is to a very large extent. And I'm not just talking about Islamic education or education or Islamic studies or whatever, because the old kind of single disciplinary approach is not going to work anymore in a post-normal world, right? We need transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches. So maybe we need to teach Islam right from the beginning as a transdisciplinary discipline rather than as a single kind of religious faith-based subject.
You raise an interesting point. You just triggered a thing. You mentioned the Sharia, and in your thoughts, certainly something that I've used in discussions and engagements with other people is that you make the telling point again and again in all your books that many of the problems that you've seen in contemporary Muslim societies have arisen from the fact that the Sharia has been limited to the kind of what we would say the domains of law. Now, for some people, some would see it as an oxymoron because they translate Sharia as law, but you see Sharia as a kind of a problem-solving methodology, more particularly as a tool which can be then developed and applied in different contexts, as opposed to kind of a static, set-down body of law and information that existed. Just explain to us what happened, because I remember your conversation with Parvez Manzoor, which you also discuss in Desperately Seeking Paradise, where you have this conversation with him. I don't know if it was real or just kind of,
almost everything in Desperately Seeking Paradise is real.
I get the point, but you raise the issue of the Sharia, where he says, and you've made the point that the Sharia is not divine. And people, when I wrote this in an article some years back in one of the local papers, the Muslim communities got into an uproar because they didn't understand the context in which I was referring to. But you made the point that when Muslim jurisprudence, fiqh, acquired its systematic juristic form during the Abbasid period, it incorporated the logic of Muslim imperialism at that particular time. And so the laws that were applicable in that particular period within the Abbasid context became incorporated into the developed jurisprudence, the fiqh. And that fiqh became kind of static. And in 21st century society, the imposition of the Sharia is the imposition of the fiqh. Can you just clarify that aspect for us and break it down?
In a sense, the Sharia itself developed as a problem-solving methodology. What were the great Imams doing? Malik, Hanafi, Imam Hanbal, what were they doing? They were trying to solve the problems of their society using what they had learned from the Quran and
so what went wrong? What went wrong then?
No, from their point of view, nothing went wrong, because they came up with a solution to the problems of their society. And that's how Sharia actually developed. I mean, it was a problem-solving methodology right from the beginning. But then when you freeze that methodology and you freeze the end product of that methodology, then when you apply it again, you just recreate the period, in a sense.
Because I think we have lost the sound. I think we've lost you. Now you clear. I think we've I thought we lost the sound, but you seem to be clear. Are you there? You can go ahead.
Yeah. So the Sharia, right from the beginning, it developed as a problem-solving methodology, because that's what the great Imams were doing. And I don't think they were thinking that their opinions will be frozen in history and will become eternal in that sense. So given that bulk of the Sharia is basically fiqh, and given that fiqh are the opinion of the great imams, then clearly it's not divine. And since these opinions are frozen in history because they reflect the problems they were solving, it makes no sense to us. So what we need to do is to kind of rethink the Sharia as a contemporary problem-solving enterprise, right? Which may have totally different tools. I mean, for example, they were using analogy, they were using custom, a bit of ijtihad, whatever the criteria there and the methodology they have developed. We now need to develop new methodologies. I don't know what these methodologies will be, but we have to develop new transdisciplinary methodologies of how we kind of how do we make the ethics of Islam real in society. In a sense,
so you are calling
great deal of what we see as Islam in contemporary times is devoid of ethics, because ethics was the kind of ethics it had was the ethics of the 8th, 9th, 10th century, Muslim society with its problems. Now we need to invoke, and this is often why very religious people have all the ritualistic piety, but none of the ethics.
You make the point. So as I understand it, then that there is a dislocation that arises. So when, for example, you had the classic example of the Taliban imposing or calling for the reintroduction of the Sharia, in reality, fiqh. Yeah. What I understand then is that they truncate the fiqh to the extent that they just focus on the issue of crime and punishment. And it's the imposition of a body of jurisprudence that emerged in the 11th and the 12th century in the 21st century. Yeah. So would I be correct that you as a scholar, I mean, I see you as an Islamic scholar, are calling for the introduction of the Sharia, but you see it as a problem-solving methodology, as opposed to, for example, the chants of those within the Islamic movement or people in your country, Anjum Chowdhury, calling for the Sharia, they're calling for something else.
It's a totally different. But basically, I'm saying I'm agreeing with a number of contemporary scholars who are arguing that we need to return to Maqasid al-Sharia, the higher objectives of the Sharia, which are what? Justice, fairness, things that we will identify as ethics, and reshape Sharia for contemporary times.
In your country, I mean,
and it will include lots of things. I mean, it will have. I mean, Sharia would have the dimension of public policy, for example.
Are the neo-Salafis, I may call it, not also calling for that, because they are doing away. No. They divorce the fiqh. They say let's go to the original sources. Do away with fiqh. Do the neo-Salafi movement, do they not do that as well?
Not where I'm standing from. I think they're just kind of reimposing their own version of classic fiqh in one way or the other. And a lot of that is based on hadith, and many of these hadiths are suspicious.
So you, in conclusion on that point, when you say that the Sharia, if it's to become the guiding principle of Muslim societies, you make the point that it has to be rescued from
it has to be rethought. I'm not saying Sharia as it exists. I'm saying we need to rethink Sharia on the basis of maqasid, and then use it as a problem-solving tool of contemporary society.
Does Islamic banking, I mean, Islamic banking as an example, would that be not a kind of a...
You see, Islamic banking is an excellent example of trying to solve contemporary problems using tools that existed in history.
Is it not just simply an amalgamation of the Western capitalist banking system?
Nijatullah Siddiqui, Professor Nijatullah Siddiqui, who's the pioneer of Islamic economics, who worked on Islamic economics for last 50 years. I also edited a journal called Critical Muslim.
Yes. You still do. Yes.
And I asked him to write an article for Critical Muslim, summarizing his thoughts and ideas and experiences of working in Islamic economics. And the last sentence or last paragraph of that article was that we have that the Muslim economists, working on Islamic economics, rediscover capitalism using the Sharia.
Hmm.
And actually, I wrote to him saying, do you really want to say that? He says, that is the truth. Of course, I want to say that. So that article was published. It's in one of our issues, right? So essentially, Islamic economics has basically turned out to be a capitalism, minus interest, but plus administration charge, which sometimes tend to be bigger than the interest. Right, and there's no solution for inflation or anything like that. You're doing this. You're doing the same thing, but apparently Sharia compliant. Right. We need new thought and new thinking for a new post-normal world, which is going to become more chaotic, more complex, and more contradictory. Right, and there are no analogies. We need to really rethink fresh completely, right? And it is something that we need to do not just for ourselves, but for all of humanity, because we now live in a very interdependent, interconnected world, which we have never done in history before. There was always Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. It doesn't exist anymore. We are all interconnected in that sense.
You are very passionate about a number of these issues, like, for example, climate change, which you mentioned earlier. But do you not sometimes see the skewed application of climate change? The climate change and the climate movement has been
Yusuf, everything can be abused. There is nothing in this world which somebody will not find a way to abuse, right? So what we need to do is to keep a critical distance. Right? We need to critique everything. We don't accept anything without question. Questioning is important. And there are a number of questions we need to ask. The first questions we ask, who benefits?
Yes.
First question, who benefits, right? Second, question is, does it actually solve our problems or does it increases our problems? I mean, every advanced, we for example, we take it for granted that if a technology can be developed, it should be developed. Nobody asked the question, well, should it ought to develop? Will it enhance justice? Right? Will it enhance cooperation amongst people? Will it distribute resources? Right? But people just develop technologies because and other people go and buy it whether they need it or not in that sense. So everything can be abused. And everything will produce conspiracy theories, but we need to take critical distance, right? By definition, I would argue that Muslims should be critical by definition, because we are not asked to accept the existence of God or the Quran on blind faith.
Yes.
Right? You see, anybody who has engaged with the Quran knows that the Muslim God is an argumentative God. He asks questions. He asks you to ask questions again and again. The Quran is full of questions from beginning to end. Have you not done that? Have you not seen that? Have you not experienced this? So by definition, we ought to be critical folks who look at things critically.
So when you look at then ideological currents,
that includes climate change, that includes everything else. Yeah.
When you then take and look at these kind of grand ideas, for example, this takes me to so many avenues. But for example, a concept like democracy. The idea that people have all people, ijma, and shura, mutual consultation. These can be viewed as kind of democratic means of decision making. But democracy as not necessarily an ideal, but as a practical reality has failed in the Western world. It's failed on all levels, particularly in the United States, the United Kingdom. It's been used as a tool again for abuse. So would the democratic ideal be something that we'd turn towards?
No, you see, again, we need to take a critical approach to democracy. Democracy as a practical system, right, in my opinion, is a good thing. And it can be justified in Islamic terms. But democracy as an ideology is quite different matter, in a sense. It is when things are turned into an ideology, then they become political tools. And then you can use them to abuse people, in a sense. But contemporary democracies are in trouble because of the post-normal nature of time, over time. Right? Differences, can emerge very, very quickly and proliferate because the nature of modern communication. Somebody can say something politically, say, nefarious, and it can go viral within a day, right? So that has made democracy difficult to sustain. But that doesn't mean democracy as an idea, as a practical thing, is not very good. Probably, as I think was it Churchill or whoever said that it is the worst system apart from all the others, which are even worse.
Professor, and I accept that, and I see your point of view. So you wouldn't then take this loony approach of then, as I see many Muslim intellectuals, and I see many young Muslim intellectuals in the United Kingdom. I'm talking about the extreme factions, but I'm in groups like people I've known, Ayera, and many other organizations that are calling for the establishment of the Khilafah. You had Hizb ut-Tahrir. A lot of them, they're immersed in Western intellectual political thought. But you wouldn't call for that, because as a system, would you see the idea of Khilafah in the Quran as something which is generic and not something?
I do not see the notion of Khilafah in the Quran as a political. I see
generic. Would I be correct that it's generic?
As a we are all Khalifa of Allah in the sense.
Yes.
We are all trustees. So we have a amana, and the amana is the world. The amana is over society. The amana is the world. Amana is our family, right? And we need to preserve and conserve that amana and take it. When we leave, it has to be in a better position than we came in. Right? We did not just look after the trust, but we enhanced it. Right? But the Khilafat in history has not worked in Islam. The first four caliphs, 3 were murdered. Well, that doesn't say much about Khilafat. And then, of course, when Muawiyah came along, he says, "I'm the first king of Islam." Full stop. You can call me whatever you like. But I'm the first king of Islam, and they're dynasties. So all the caliphs were dynasties. And even the classical, golden age period of Abbasids and Umayyads, they were killing each other. What the Abbasids did to the Umayyads, they butchered them.
Yes.
Of course, the Abbasids themselves killed each other to get in power. So, what kind of Khilafat are you talking about? Even in your own history, the Khilafat has no meaning. It doesn't work at all, right? In that sense, we have to have a consensus-based political system that is accountable to the people. Simple as that. If you want to call it democracy, that's fine. If you want to call it X, that's fine. Doesn't really matter. It has to be based on consensus of the people and be totally accountable. Right? The kind of accountability that the old woman can stand up and say to Umar, "You are wearing, a sheet of cloth which is twice as big as mine. Where did you get that?" That kind of accountability, right? And then, Umar Abdul Aziz crying in front of the people saying, "If I made mistake, right, do forgive me. I'm only a human being. But what I have is yours." Right? There is no difference between you and me, even though you have chosen me as your ruler.
Yes.
Yes, he wasn't chosen, but anyway, even though I am your ruler, right? I mean, that kind of accountability, and the ruler has to be based on the consensus of the people. If the people are happy to have a monarch, it's fine. I have no objection to that, but it has to be based. You cannot impose it. It has to be based on the consensus of the people.
The reality is that, you gave a phenomenal example of Hazrat Umar, and that's the kind of leaders or the type of leaders we require in society. But is a concern not for you that mass consensus could also lead to the development and the rise of authoritarian structures and authoritarianism.
Yeah.
I mean, Western Europe, you mentioned the rise of fascism. The masses in Poland, France, the whites in Europe, they want this kind of fascism being imposed. I mean, you talk about the war in Russia and Ukraine. Ukrainian society is also immersed with Nazism, neo-Nazism, Azov Battalion. I mean, you talk about Western Europe, France, Germany, Poland. Is that not a danger? So when we talk about democratic ideal and the consensus of the masses, is that not also a danger?
I'm talking about not consensus of mass as a kind of a, big entity. I'm talking about consensus of thinking rational, educated people in that sense. I mean, society has to understand what political system they are supporting, what it means for them. But I would also argue that if you have a open society, you're less likely to, move towards authoritarianism than if you have a closed society. Part of the problem in contemporary times that it has closed people up. So people who rely on social media and the internet, they exist in their own closed bubbles. So contemporary Poland, for example, we cannot describe as an open society because there's people who exist in silos, right? And some of these silos are far-right silos. That's all they feed. They get their own alternative facts, and the system perpetuate. We need to be kind of much more open. Here we need to rethink, for example, the function of social media in society. If there was no social media, there would not have been the genocide of Rohingya, which is basically perpetuated by social media. If there was no artificial intelligence, there will be no genocide of the Uyghur people in China, because it was the artificial intelligence and the surveillance and all the other stuff that China kind of used to manipulate them and then isolate them and then start a system. So we need to think deeply about these issues. They're going to shape our future if we do not. Part of the thing is, why do I insist on futures thinking? My second book is called The Future of Muslim Civilization. Most of my life, 50 years of thought and all that, focused on thinking about the future. Why? A very simple reason. If you do not think about the future, somebody else will think about the future, your future. Example I gave for W.C. Blunt. And then your future will be colonized. Just as your past was colonized, your future will be colonized. And if you want to keep your future open and decolonized, then you have to think and shape it yourself. And all future works begins with now. The function of all future works is the kind of whatever kind of future you want, you have to start working for it now. Only then, 10, 15 years, you may, if with the will of God, actually shape and realize some of what you wanted to achieve.
You speak about, and we're almost going to come to a close shortly, but you talk about rejecting traditionalism in many of your works and embracing the tradition. What do you mean by that?
Well, you see, first of all, we need to differentiate between the two. Tradition is a living entity. Tradition is dynamic. Traditions reinvent itself. It adjusts to change and therefore reinvents itself.
How do you give an example? You can give an example of practical example.
I can't give. I mean, if look at some of the recent Western traditions. For example, the tradition of Father Christmas.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a totally invented tradition, invented by Coca-Cola. Right, in a sense, right? And it's now become tradition, right, in a sense. So traditions can be invented, right? And old traditions need to be rethought, and they have to adjust to change. And if they don't adjust to change, they become customs. And customs often become oppressive. And traditionalisms basically are traditions which are kind of fixed in history and have become ossified and are essentially customs. So we need to differentiate between the two. So I'll give you an example. Muslims think that having wearing certain kind of clothes and doing certain kind of things is very close to the Sunnah because the Prophet did that. Well, he lived in a particular environment that demanded particular things. So the traditions that he established were in tune with the environment. So he dressed the way he dressed because he lived in Makkah and Medina, and they were desert towns. So if you dress like that, say in Iceland or in Finland, you're a fool. Yeah, because you will freeze to death.
Of course,
right? You'll freeze to death. But if you think that the Prophet's tradition was not what he wore, but being dressed modestly and elegantly, and if you are in Finland and cold area, you dress modest and elegant. You're following the tradition, but you have reinvented it to suit the environment, right? In a sense, right? And people, for example, think maswak is very good because the Prophet did that, and you find lots of Muslims going around, in ridiculous thing. Maswak is very good, right?
Yes.
There is no, yeah, but there's nothing wrong with brushing your teeth properly.
So basically, what you're saying,
basic tradition that the Prophet introduced is when you wake up in the morning, you should brush your teeth. Not that you should use the maswak. The tradition is not the maswak, but the act. Right? What is the tradition? What is the tradition when the Prophet went, for example, the conquest of Makkah? He said, what should I do to you? And they said, you are a good brother, you will only do good. So he said, this day you are all forgiven. Right? The tradition is forgiveness. That is the tradition. Do we follow that tradition? No, we want to follow how he dressed and whether he had a beard or not and how long his beard was. Right? In quite kind of absurd. That's not a tradition. The tradition is that he forgave people. Right? What did he do at Hudaybiyah? The Quraysh are in front of him and he's sitting there. They're negotiating and they agree. And then the agreement starts, in the name of Allah. And the Quraysh say, well, we are Quraysh, we don't accept Allah. Right? The Bible says, cut that out. Right? This is the agreement between Muhammad. You know that. He's kind of systematic. Yes. What is the tradition he is suggesting? The tradition is suggesting that under certain circumstances, it's better to compromise than not to compromise. Do we ever, think like that? When he went to Medina, what he did? What's the first thing he did? He made a constitution, the famous constitution of Medina, which actually lists all the members, Ansars, Muhajirs, all the Jewish tribes, the Christian tribes, the Sabian tribes, and everybody. Right? Right? He created a pluralistic, framework based on consensus in the sense. Yeah. Do we do that? No, we want to impose that. That's the tradition. So we have no notion of what tradition is. We think things that are fixed in history, which have no relevance to contemporary society, are part of our tradition. Right? People will fight over, and in certain mosques, and even it has happened here, certainly it happened in certain mosques in Pakistan, for example, people will be killed, right? Because they do not pray in a certain way. Right? So the tradition is, as Tablighi Jamaat will tell you, that you must roll your trousers. Right? Actually, the Prophet never wore trousers. They did not exist in those days. Right? But his Jalabia, Jubba, whatever, went right.
Shalwar Khamis or something along that line.
He didn't wear, or Shalwar Kameez, he didn't wear Shalwar Kameez. So every sudden new convert to Islam has to wear Shalwar Kameez because it's a tradition. But it's a tradition of Pakistan, but it's got nothing to do with Islam. So we need to rethink what tradition is, in a sense. Tradition is something that gives us a sense of history and our identity, makes us confidence, but then propels us towards the future. It's a living thing. It's not something that drags us back to history. Tradition gives us confidence, it gives us sense of identity. We understand where we are coming from, right? And we have a sense of direction of where we want to go. The tradition is all about propelling you towards the future, not about dragging you, in a dim and distant.
It's very much a case, Professor, of taking the following the Sunnah is in fact emulating the ethical paradigm of the Prophet, as opposed to following the context. You see, people confuse following the context of the 6th century with emulating the Sunnah, whereas in actual fact, following the Sunnah is emulating the ethical paradigm and the principles behind the
concept and ethical paradigm. Yes, exactly. That is my point, and has been my point in most of my writings. That we need to return to the ethics of Islam. Right? Where is the ethics? Where is the ethics in the Sharia? Right? Sharia is essentially a list of do's and don'ts, despite all the sophistication it has. Most aliens will reduce it to a list of do's and don'ts. But even then, they don't realize that some things which are good become bad in certain context. If the environment change, they become bad, right? So even the good has to be taught all the time, right? So ethics, the kind of ethics that we are dealing with has to move. It has to be anchored on certain values and certain concepts, but it has to move and see how the world is changing. And the point now with my ideas of post-normal time is that things are not just changing. It is not just that change is accelerating, but the point is the nature of change is itself changing. The kind of change we are experiencing, we have not experienced in history before. So the nature of change itself has changed. And while change continues in an accelerating way. And this poses us some phenomenally different challenges, totally different challenges. And if we want to be true to our faith and true to what we believe in, then we have to rethink a great deal of what we believe.
Yeah. I don't want to take you back to the past, but since you've mentioned the Prophet Muhammad, and since it's something that, and I'm gonna wrap up on this theme here. This is probably going to be our last theme for this evening's discussion. One of the works that made me fall in love with your books and your thoughts and your writings, the very first book I came across was when I was in school, and in the latter part of my school years, and this is the late 90s, I think about 98, 99, where a teacher of mine praised the works of Salman Rushdie, the Satanic Verses. And I came across your book totally by chance, one co-authored with Melvin Davis, Distorted Imagination, Lessons from the Rushdie Affair. I borrowed it from the library. It's difficult to find today. I don't think it's available on Amazon. I believe it's no longer published. But that book basically I was fascinated because I was very young during the time of the 80s when the Rushdie saga kind of became global, but I never saw this kind of a process of deconstruction that you actually literally tore him up, and the ideology that kind of enmeshed the entire book. What was it about the Satanic Verses, which by and large was a very mediocre book? I've read it some years back, but what was it about as a kind of a standard textbook or kind of a fictionalized parody of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that caused such an uproar, bearing in mind, that in today's time, we've got far more vicious and pernicious material out there attacking Islam. What was so unique about this?
I think it's because it was the first time where the life of the Prophet was systematically parodied. So basically what he did was to take the life of the Prophet as it exists, including using certain texts. Tabari, I think, is one of the texts he used.
Yes.
Right. And then parody it systematically, very, very systematically. So I remember reading the book because I was flying from Kuala Lumpur to London, and I had bought a copy. I was reading back, and I was astonished at the systematic way he parodied it. It was the parallels. There were bits on Aisha, some who's crossing going to Gulf through the river and all that. But the overall, and the various other.
They were essentially
magical, realistic. But the basic thing was very systematically So that's somebody who is inside and but also an outsider, if you see what I mean. So, and that, I think that disturbed me, and that disturbed a lot of people.
It was essentially, I mean, 2 chapters, I believe, in the book that really created the controversy. I think I've got it in my library somewhere around here.
Yeah.
The chapter on Mahound. But you do describe it as a postmodernist text, and this is 88.
Yeah, this is when postmodernism is at its height. I mean, Rushdie, he himself says that I was a postmodern novelist. I mean, magical realism is one of the kind of iconic notions of postmodern thought. It's part of postmodern literature. And he uses the idea of magical realism. I mean, again, his Midnight Children is very much a
Shame, the same thing.
Modern book, yeah, and also Shame that followed. And so he did a very systematic destruction. I mean, he started with India, and then he did Pakistan, and then he did Islam, in a sense. The one on India upset a lot of Indians, but I don't think it was greatly concerned. But the Satanic Verse is very different from. I mean, I actually like Midnight Children to a certain extent, but Satanic Verse is very different. That the parody and frankly abuse is very systematic. It's not just so he took the whole of Sira virtually. Right? If he had taken 1 or 2 incidents, I don't think the controversy will be that much. But he took the whole of Sira, in a sense, and that's what. So that's basically attacking the very fundamental of Islam. I mean, that's something that we hold very, very dear, right? In a sense. And remember, the postmodern notion that there's not much distinction between reality and image. So he is creating an image, right, which is also going to affect the reality to some extent. So a lot of people, for example, who would never read anything about Islam, who read literature, who read that book, and that's the impression of Islam they will get, and they probably keep most of their lives.
But so you see the thing is, by parodying the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, besides the obvious abuse, what was the key objective? Was the key objective to create a distortion? Because people and Westerners, some of them were confused. They were making the point, well, this is fiction. This is false. But I mean, the aspect of the Satanic Verse is very much part of Islamic history in the writings of Tabari.
Yeah, it was. Actually, the thing is that what happens in magical realism to some extent, you take real facts and you mix them up with fiction and magic and fantasy and what have you. So it was the real facts of the Sira that were manipulated with. Well, there was a problem in that sense. It was not a constructed, fictionalized account. I mean, he had the Sira in front of him as he was writing, systematically. I mean, in a sense, it took him 5 years to write, he says, and that's a long time to construct some, So it was a very systematic job. It was not something that he did overnight without thinking,
Is a Sira? I mean, the one Sira that is now cited and it's so popular amongst missionaries and Islamophobes is that they cite Ibn Ishaq, and I mean the popular available book is Alfred Jom's translation. Now you've written a lot about the Sira. I mean, you've one of your earlier books about, I think, was Muhammad Aspects of Biography. Have you found anything, the fact that the classical Sira material, as opposed to, for example, the more 20th century works like Sirat al-Nabi and Haykal, do you find the classical Sira material as problematic on certain levels in terms of material, in terms of Guillaume's translation? I mean, for example,
Guillaume's translation is, I think Guillaume's translation is a very poisonous translation. It's a very well-known Syrian scholar, A.L. Tibabi, wrote a very detailed analysis of Guillaume's translation of Ibn Ishaq.
Because that uses the basis by Orientalists. You see, the Orientalists cite their works on Guillaume.
Both Ibn Ishaq and Tabari use a great deal of legend in the early part of their texts, and basically these are just legends and myths which are presented as history, and that's quite problematic in that sense. I find Ibn Sa'd quite problematic, and of course the satanic verses incident isn't a very,
Yes. Yes. You mentioned historical revisionism in distorted imagination, particularly, and I don't want to keep you up too late, Professor. I see that I don't know what time it's in the United Kingdom, but historical revisionism of you decided to attack, well, I wouldn't say attack, critique the works of Patricia Crone and Michael Cook. Yeah. What I find, and particularly in the field that we're involved in, I mean, I'm involved in religious debate, a lot of the works of John Wansborough, Michael Cook, Patricia Crone from Hagerism has been popularized today in the form of tracts amongst missionaries and missionary circles. What's the best way to deal with this kind of material that's coming out, and now that's on the popular level, populist level at the very least?
I don't really know how to answer that. I mean, the Hagerism thesis has been so debunked. Even Michael Cook and Patricia Crone, who by the way died recently, kind of retracted their thesis, denounced the book themselves, their own work, so that there is no, and Wansborough is laughed at in Muslim intellectual circles, to suggest that, for example, the Quran was not revealed in Arabia but somewhere in Syria or Palestine is quite ridiculous.
Yes.
Right, or it wasn't revealed in the kind of 7th century, but it's the 8th or 9th century somewhere else. The historical evidence is so strong. I mean, the Muslim sources are so vast. The problem for many Western scholars, and I suspect for Muslim scholars, is that our sources are very, very big. There's a huge amount of sources there. Right? How do you shift through those sources? And of course, there are lots of different people, working on the sources during that period, and many had different opinions. So the sources differ from each other. They have different flavor, the opinions. Lots of politics comes in. So one particular group will have emphasized one thing, another group, may create some false hadiths to go with it, etc., etc. So you can always kind of, if you wanted to, create a totally different picture from the sources because they are so vast. Right? But at the same time, we also have very detailed, authentic sources that my contemporary scholars have gone through and looked at. And the kind of daft thesis that people like Wansborough or Patricia Crone come up with them. It's laughable stuff. I mean, it goes in the scholarship, but it's essentially historically, it's a laughable stuff. Even though these guys may be professors, that doesn't stop us from laughing at them.
Sure. Any new books for the future?
The best thing to do is to say how ridiculous and stupid you are, and basically not bother too much. The more oxygen you give these guys, the worse it becomes. Once you have to engage with them. The books must fight books. So you engage with them scholarly. And once they've been debunked, right, then you move on.
Yeah. Professor, any new books that you're working on for the future?
I'm always working on a book, but as you probably have noticed, I've given up journalism, I've given up television, right, because I am not as active and healthy as I was 5-10 years ago. Now I've just turned 70, so I'm slowing down. So whatever I'm writing at the moment will take me a very long time to finish. But there will be other books.
Inshallah. Your final parting words of advice to South Africans. This is going to be shared globally, but words of advice to South Africans in terms of the future. We're living in dislocated times, troubling times, disturbing times. What do we do?
You use your ethics to navigate your way out of these disturbing times. And one way to do that is to think of the future, to look forward, always to look forward. One of the things we Muslims must realize is that we cannot lose hope, right? Pessimism is not allowed. Despair is forbidden in Islam, as you know, right? So we have to be hopeful, but the hope has to be transformed into real action. Just sitting back in the chair and hoping is not good enough. You have to trust in God. As the Prophet said, "Patta your camel." And the tying your camel bit is to be, in my opinion, futures literate. In contemporary post-normal times, it is very, very important to appreciate what is around the horizon, what is out there that could really disturb the society, what is out there that could present a major challenge to what you believe, what is out there that looks innocent at the moment, but could become very destructive in 5-10 years' time. Right. So that requires a lot of thought, a lot of critical thinking, but it requires looking at the future. So be future oriented.
Professor, I want to thank you for your time that you've given us. It's been so fascinating. I could probably go on for another 2 hours discussing with you. There's so many avenues of your thoughts. It's been a real privilege, and we hope to have you again in the future, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Yusuf.
Well, thank you. And that's all we have for this evening, folks. That was Professor Ziauddin Sardar, who is an award-winning writer, a cultural critic, a public intellectual, and described by Prospect magazine as one of Britain's top 100 public intellectuals, and by the Independent newspaper as Britain's own Muslim polymath. So if you're watching us, wherever you are, we wish you the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. And if you're traveling, have a safe journey home.